Uh, Thank you for giving me the honor of kicking off this amazing series. Special thanks to Rita. I do have to say that I was a huge admirer and, dare I say, big fan of Judge McCaffrey, so it is a special honor to be here. Regardless of how today goes, you have amazing speakers coming up, so please come back again. I'd like to start by telling you a story. It is a story I've told before. I find it sometimes heads off in directions that I don't anticipate, as stories sometimes do. And when it's done, I'd like to loop back and highlight some issues. And those issues may inform our discussion afterwards, and perhaps will inform how you listen to and participate with your other speakers for the rest of this series. So as Jeff said, I graduated from Vermont Law School in 1987, and I had the great good fortune of clerking for Judge Billings in Rutland in the Federal District Court in Vermont right after graduation. And then I spent 2 years in private practice up in Burlington at the firm then known as Dinsey, Erdman and Clapp. And while the attorneys there were brilliant and incredible litigators, we were fighting mostly about money. And that didn't really grab my soul. So I then became a deputy state's attorney, a deputy prosecutor in the Windsor County State's Attorney's Office in White River Junction. And the state's attorney is the chief prosecutor in the county. In New Hampshire, you call it the county prosecutor. Other places you call it the DA. What's interesting about the state's attorneys in Vermont is they have general jurisdiction. When I started, littering was a crime, and we prosecuted littering cases all the way up through homicide. So pretty early on in my prosecutorial career, I am still a baby prosecutor, as we called them, and a case arrives on my desk. And what that means is that the police paperwork has arrived. And here's the story contained within that police paperwork. A woman ran a small farm in Windsor County. And one of the ways that she made money was she had a roadside vegetable stand. She discovered pretty early on that she couldn't monitor the vegetable stand and attend to all of her other farm chores. So she turned it into a self-help. And she had a sign that had the price of all the vegetables and a shoebox where people would make their own change. That was going fine in the beginning, and then she discovered that she was getting ripped off. She fretted about what to do, and ultimately, cleverly, I think, set up a video camera. To her further credit, though, she put up a big sign that said, "You're being recorded." Well, you can probably guess what happens. Caught on video is a young mom and her 6 or 7-year-old son stealing vegetables. Farmer wrestles with what to do and ultimately turns the videotape over to the Vermont State Police. Trooper responds, small community, they know who the young mom is. They go to interview her. She denies everything, but it doesn't matter. She's caught on videotape. The young mom is issued a citation, a directive to appear in court 6 weeks down the road, and the case is sent to my office to prosecute. So I look at it and I say, this is a slam dunk petty larceny. The non-permissive taking of tangible personal property of another with the intent to deprive that other person of their property. Maximum penalty under Vermont law, a year in jail, $1,000 fine, or both. I have to confess, I chuckled a bit at the case. I am originally from New York City. This sure felt like a quintessentially Vermont crime to me. nevertheless, I'm wrestling with what's the right way to punish this young mom. So I decide to stroll down the hall in the state's attorney's office to speak to the late and wonderful victim advocate in that office, Pam Weigel. I say, Pam, got the stolen vegetable case, slam dunk, what punishment should I be seeking? And she shakes her head as if to say, you young whippersnapper, you have no idea. Before you think about consequences, let's talk to the farmer to see what she wants. So I said, okay. So we arranged that meeting, and the farmer comes in, and I explain the law and the possible options, and I say to her, what punishment would you like to see? The farmer says, you know, I don't really want to see punishment. And I don't need restitution for stolen vegetables. I don't even care if this young mom is prosecuted. I just want a chance to talk to her. And I say, well, we don't do that. And Pam says, we'll arrange it. And I said, we'll arrange it. So a meeting is set up. And it is the farmer, the young mom, Pam, and me. And after introductions, I turn to the farmer and I say, is there anything that you'd like to say? And she leans forward and she locks eyes with the mom. And the farmer, the victim, says this. She says, I am so sorry. I am so sorry that you didn't feel supported enough by this community that you could come and ask for help. And I just want you to know, if you ever need food or money or childcare, I'm there to help you. And I know that there are lots of people in this community who would be willing to help you. The mom, the accused, starts crying. And she says, I am so sorry. I am a horrible mother. What have I taught my child? Being a single parent is just so difficult. And the farmer starts crying, says, I know. And I look over, and the victim advocate is crying. Rumor has it, the prosecutor is crying. And Pam gives me a nod of the head, and I am typically oblivious to what that means. And she actually kicks me in the shin and gestures again, and I get the message that she wants me to leave. And so actually Pam and I leave the room, and the victim, the farmer, and the defendant, the young mom, are in the room together for about 20 minutes. They come out arm in arm, and I say to the farmer, all set? And she says, all set. And I say to the young mom, all set? And she says, all set. And that's the last that we ever saw of either of those individuals. Now, I don't know about you, but that sure felt like justice to me. Not justice that we would see in a courtroom, but perhaps an even bigger, maybe almost cosmic justice. I would like to think that that case informed everything that I did as a prosecutor, and it didn't. It took years. Honestly, it took decades for the significance of that case to really resonate with me and fundamentally change the way I think about harm and crime and responses. So let me loop back a little bit and highlight some issues that I think are raised by this case. I'm going to start with the responding police officer, the trooper. That trooper effectively had two options. Option 1, exercise discretion and do nothing. Option 2, send the case forward for prosecution. There are many, many more options though. And increasingly, we are seeing law enforcement officials working with community-based organizations to create a referral mechanism so that cases don't have to go to the prosecutor, don't have to go to the court, but can be resolved at the community level the way we used to address issues. That's not a criticism of the trooper, it was a criticism of the system that hadn't fully developed the alternatives that are so important. And how about the prosecutor? I was trained in rules and law and procedure and advocacy to maximize and highlight the strength of the state's position. And I was also trained to maximize and highlight the weaknesses of the defense. That's great for an adversarial system. That is lousy for strengthening relationships and making stronger communities. So we need to train prosecutors differently. Part of what we are doing at Vermont Law School with our restorative justice program, to understand there are different ways to think about harm and conflict and crime. And how about voice? Parties who are harmed have to have a real, meaningful voice in shaping the outcome. We have outsourced our responses to harm to the state and have constrained the way that the most affected party can weigh in. So what Pam taught me, though it took a long time for me to learn, is we have to give voice to the party most directly affected. But it isn't just the harmed party who needs to have voice. It is the responsible party as well, the person who caused the harm. One of the things that you will hear increasingly as you learn about restorative justice is a really wonderful phrase, and that is that harmed people harm people. Harmed people harm people. No one should be judged solely by the worst thing that they've ever done. And there is always a backstory. Does it exonerate? Does it mean that there shouldn't be responsibility? No, but it is part of the picture. And in thinking about harm and who is responsible for the harm, we have to step back and look at more systemic issues. Every time a case arises, it's an opportunity to think about what are the community factors that may be contributing, what are the systemic factors that may be contributing to people causing harm. We have created this remarkably efficient conveyor belt system of justice, air quotes. We need to slow it down and look at the complexity of issues that leads to offending behavior. So we have an opportunity to move away from a punitive model. And some people may say, that's all well and good for a stolen zucchini, irony of which is at the end of the growing season, you can't even give your zucchini away. Nevertheless, what about more serious crimes, more serious harm? Restorative justice is a process. It's not an outcome. And the process can be applied across the board. Having alternatives, giving voice, expecting accountability can apply across the criminal justice spectrum. And I believe, and not everyone agrees with this, I believe you can have punishment, that there are some people who pose an ongoing threat to the public, I believe you can have incarceration, and yet you use a restorative process to get there. So RJ, restorative justice is a paradigm shift. Instead of asking what crime was committed, we ask who was harmed, and how can the harmed party have a meaningful voice in shaping a response. Instead of seeking to determine guilt, we ask who is responsible and who has obligations as a result of causing harm. Instead of seeking punishment as a goal, we are seeking amends. How can the person who caused the harm set things right? And instead of seeking to stigmatize and label people and push them aside as other, we're looking for a strengthening of relationships and ultimately for healing. I'm going to close with something that I've been musing about, and I don't know the answer to, and maybe some of you can lend some insight into this. We are very familiar in this country with the language of punishment. And we see, splashed in the headlines, some crime was committed. And I think for lots of people, the immediate reaction is, what is the punishment going to be? Or that wasn't enough punishment. We know that language. We don't fully know the language of accountability and amends. So what I'm wondering is, do we have an innate human desire for punishment? Or do we have an innate human desire for accountability? And I think we have conflated those two things. And if we can better understand the language of accountability, I think that can become the default response, as opposed to the default response being punishment. And so events like this will help all of us better speak the language of accountability and amends, and ultimately the country as a whole will develop a fluency in restorative justice language, the language of accountability and amends. I have to put in a little bit of a plug for my employer, Vermont Law School. To its credit, it recognized the need to train lawyers and graduate students in a different way to think about harm and conflict and crime. And so Vermont Law School is the only law school in the country where a student can also earn a Master of Arts in Restorative Justice. And we have a subset of that, which is a professional certificate in restorative justice. In my grand scheme, at some point, all law schools in the country will be training their students to think differently about harm and conflict and crime. And with that, I hope we can have some discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Bobby. That was fantastic. Really excited to open up this discussion and question period for everyone. So we do ask you to either raise your hand, and I will explain. To find your raised hand function, down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a box that says participants. If you click on that box, it's going to open up a big white box of everyone that's currently in this Zoom room. at the very bottom of that box, at the very, very bottom, there's going to be a little button that says raise hand. So we do ask that to be certain that we can try and get to as many questions as possible, and to keep it a little easier for us to keep track of who's had an opportunity to ask a question, we ask you to use that raise hand button. Alternately, you can also use that chat box function. We'll be monitoring that. If you didn't find the raised hand button in your participant box, if you click on your reactions button, there should be a raised hand button there also. Bobby, we do have something in the chat box already, which is fantastic. Lisa, I see you have your hand up, so we'll get to you next. So from Caitlin in the chat box, she says, thank you for this. You're speaking to the difference between individualism and a collective way of belonging as well. Can we see these situations as systematic and collective instead of through an individualistic lens?
Whoa. I think there's some depth to that question that probably is over my head, but so we have historically looked at crime as discrete, individual, defendant-focused things to be taken care of. And RJ is a much broader view of harm. So looking at systemic issues, in addition to the immediate harm, and looking as well at, and some people might call this transformative justice, what are the broader collective societal issues that are causative factors in causing harm. So to what extent does institutional racism, does generational poverty, does adverse childhood experience and early trauma inform what later occurs? Again, not saying that individual actors don't bear responsibility for their behavior, but saying that collectively we do need to understand all those factors, because otherwise we are just ticking off individual responses to individual harm that doesn't really move us anywhere positive as a society. So I'm not sure I'm exactly answering your question, but I do think that a collective response is necessary. Communities used to resolve disputes on their own. We now outsource it. So if I think about the most remote part of Windsor County, Vermont, I don't know, maybe that's Rochester, Vermont, or down Baltimore or Ludlow, harm happens there and it gets outsourced to White River Junction, that is removed and separate from where it occurred. I think communities need to be more engaged in responding to their own harm. We've kind of sanitized our communities by outsourcing it as if it doesn't exist. Well, it does exist, and the better able a community is to address it, I think the stronger that community will be.
Wonderful. Thank you, Caitlin, for that question. Thank you, Bobby. So I'd like to open this up next to Cicero Institute. You have your hand up.
Hi. 1 second. There we go. Let me take down my hand, or my hands down. Perfect. Hi, Bobby. We've spoken before. My question here is, I know that there's been kind of a growth of restorative justice centers across the state, and I was wondering if you could speak to some of the maybe preliminary evidence or any research on the impact of restorative justice on recidivism and kind of the likelihood to commit a crime again.
Thanks. I don't have immediate access to studies. I won't pick. I know there's someone who's participating. I saw in the list who probably would have more immediate access. But what I will say is I know in Vermont that our diversion programs and our community justice centers have pretty good data, some of which I know is available online, to show lower recidivism rates, so lower rates of repeat offense for people who receive a restorative response as opposed to a punitive response. You know, a theory of punishment, a theory of incarceration is this notion of deterrence. We're going to inflict pain on you, because that's what punishment is, to teach you not to do something wrong. And there's pretty good data that deterrence doesn't work. Incarceration is a criminogenic risk factor for further criminology. What does that mean? Sending people to jail increases the risk that they will reoffend. So if deterrence doesn't work, if sending people to jail increases the risk that they're going to reoffend, then we absolutely have to develop alternative responses, including restorative responses. I've long felt that significant criminal justice change doesn't happen until the fiscal conservatives appreciate how wasteful, financially wasteful it is to send people to jail, because it is just compounding governmental expenditures. And to a certain extent, I think that is starting to happen. There is some national dialogue now about RJ. Vermont Law School became the recipient of a grant. Senator Leahy was very instrumental in getting this put into the budget. The law school is now the host of the National Center on Restorative Justice. And we will be doing some research together with our partners at the University of Vermont and the University of San Diego to try to document the benefits of RJ and how that influences recidivism rates. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Thanks, Bobby. So Fran has a wonderfully provocative question for you. Using a restorative justice lens, how would you hold accountable the people who attacked the Capitol?
Thank you and no thank you. So I have to tell you, when I watched that, my instinct was, we need to crush these people. And I caught myself. And I've asked a lot of folks who have many more years steeped in RJ, you know, is your first response a restorative response? And almost all of them said, no, it's a process in their brain as well. And it's a process in my brain as well. So I don't know that I have a good answer to that. I do know that we have lost the ability to talk to each other, and that we have managed to turn our political, those with whom we disagree politically, into our adversaries. I think I would start with talking to the law enforcement officials, the congressional staffers, and the members of Congress and the Senate, to ask them first, how did this feel for you? And what response would you like to see? Because unless we start there, we are replicating the mistake that we have in the criminal justice system of government imposing a response. Ultimately, maybe this comes down to some type of truth and reconciliation process. When there's systemic harm, individual prosecutions often don't work. But I will confess, I am an optimist by nature, but I do not have a good feel for how we learn to talk civilly with people with whom we dramatically disagree. And I don't know how we get there. But may I just say, I don't know if I'm breaking the rules, Jen. If anyone has a reaction or a different thought and has an optimistic vision, I could use that, and perhaps the rest of the listeners could as well. And also the person who asked that great question, if you have thoughts, I hope you'll share those also.
Thanks, Bobby. Yeah, tough question. I love it. And Fran appreciates your honesty. Thank you, Fran. So Lisa Sharp Grady, your hand is up if you would like to go next.
Yes, hi, thank you. This is wonderful. So I just finished reading Waiting for an Echo by Christine Montrose, which, by the way, Sister Helen endorses on the back in case anyone's interested in reading it. It was fascinating. She talks about some things within the carceral system itself that needs to change. And you have talked about, you've offered some solutions. Some things that stuck out to me are, having communities to respond to incidences rather than outsourcing, learning the power of language to change how people think, which is amazing, just powerful. Financial incentives that will drive changes, learning how to talk to people with different views, which are all really powerful potential leverages of change. I wonder, for me as an average citizen sitting in my kitchen in rural Vermont, how do you see me beginning to make small influences to bring those changes about through some of these mechanisms?
Great question. And what I'll tell you, I don't know if you're a social media user or not, but I've been really impressed with the folks I've seen who, you can pretty well tell someone's perspective, but who posts that they would like to begin dialogue with people with whom they disagree politically. And honestly, I haven't been that brave because A, I'm not a great listener, and B, I have some pretty strong feelings about what direction we should go in. So I admire the vulnerability of folks who have said that they are prepared to have discussions with people with whom they disagree. I will say, Lisa, I've done 2 long drives recently. This fall, I drove across the country before the election out to Washington State, where my daughter lives, and picked up my spouse who flew. And without getting into explicit politics, there were some really big signs and really big flags for one candidate and almost nothing for another candidate. And don't yell at me, people who are in New England right now, but we drove down to Florida, and I won't tell you that it's 75 degrees today, and very, very similar. So, we are a deeply polarized country, and I think that change happens on a small individual level by people making individual overtures to folks with whom they disagree. And I have not practiced what I preach.
Thank you, Bobby. So Jen St. Lawrence, you have your hand up if you'd like to go next, please.
Thank you. Thanks for being here. Very informative. Thank you, Robert, and everyone on the call. I have someone very close to me who just got out of prison, and a lot of struggles that I won't go into. But my question is, how do we talk about or bring restorative justice and educate correctional officers like Jeff or others who are working in these facilities. There's a lot of brutality out there within corrections that gets swept under the rug. There's a lot of fear. How do we start to make that kind of change? I know it's a very big question, but that's what's been on my mind.
Hugely important. And one of the things that we know from models in Europe is that correctional facilities can be run in fundamentally different ways. I don't know if any of you or all of you have ever visited a correctional facility, but it is an amazing thing to do. And to think about the fact that we put human beings into cages it's extraordinary. And how could we possibly think that that is rehabilitative? One of the things that always strikes me when I visit a facility is that it isn't just the people who we have incarcerated who are in this environment every day, but it is the people who work there who are in this environment every day. So we are just starting to see individual superintendents or wardens begin to appreciate the value of using restorative justice models within correctional facilities. And I will tell you, and I can't tip my hand any more than that, but part of what we're doing at the National Center on Restorative Justice at Vermont Law School is working to create some restorative units within correctional facilities. Those places that have developed restorative units have lower disciplinary reports, lower instances of violence. Prison removes responsibility from incarcerated people. I'm not in any way suggesting it's easy. It's brutal. It's hard, but their needs are provided for. Restorative units require some self-governance, require interaction between people, and require it in a way that isn't force dependent or power dependent. So what I think we will see over time, and this is going to be a long process, is units and ultimately institutions that are built around restorative models having lower instances of correctional violence and ultimately lower recidivism rates for people who are returned to community, and that may begin to inform what happens in other locations.
So we're going to go back to the chat box for the next question, which comes from, I believe, Drew, if I'm not mistaken. How does equity enter into this, if at all? Does it matter that the outcome will vary depending on the victim?
Great question, because we say that it is a state response. And one of the benefits, arguably, of creating a criminal justice system was it deterred vigilantism. We don't want individuals exacting their own consequences. The flip side is we can't have a cookie cutter conveyor belt response. So pre-pandemic, if you were to go to a criminal court in Vermont on what's called arraignment day, when a whole bunch of cases come together, it wouldn't be uncommon for 5, 10, 15 people on the very first day they show up in court to enter a guilty plea and be done with. And a lot of those people were young people, and a lot of them were indigent, and yet were not provided counsel. And so we know how to crank folks through under that conveyor belt system. We're not good at slowing it down. So I am not suggesting that the harmed party, and just so you know, In the RJ world, we try to avoid victim and offender and we talk instead about the party who was harmed and the responsible party. I'm not saying that the harmed party has absolute voice in dictating the response, but needs to have an important and meaningful voice. And so I agree equity is important, but it doesn't have to be perfect equity. There is lots of room for individual variation.
So let's go to Nate, who has been patiently waiting with his hand up. Go ahead, Nate.
Right. So I want to respond as a volunteer in the local Hartford Community Justice Center to a couple of comments or a couple of questions, whatever. One is the question of what can I do? A couple of people asked that, and the answer that I would say to that is restorative justice is happening all the time. We're doing it daily in your community, in your county. It's happening, and it's labor intensive, and it needs people. So what you can do, both to learn a lot and to really help, is to contact your local community justice center and get trained as a panel volunteer and start participating on panels. Anyway, so that's what we can do. And speaking from that model, talking about the protesters, the rioters, if I learned that my friend Dick from down the road had gone into broken windows in the Capitol and got involved in posting stuff and all that, what I would hope would happen with Dick is that rather than getting hauled down to DC and thrown in prison down there for some highly warranted charge, that instead he'd be referred to the Justice Center locally, and that he'd show up in one of our panels and he'd sit around with a bunch of kindly neighbors who would discuss with him what he thinks about that, what was going on in his mind, how he thinks it might have affected his neighbors, and what thought process might go forward, how different people could do different things to start to mend the torn fabric of community, because that's what we're talking about in restorative justice. Is we're talking about fixing the harm that was done to a victim if possible, but in a larger sense, repairing the torn community fabric, the webs that happens when people do things like this. So that's what I would hope would happen.
Can I just say, Nate, thank you for that. I spend a fair amount of time doing course design and kind of upper level RJ work, and about 6 months ago started volunteering in Orange County with a reparative panel, and it has been just an absolutely wonderful, eye-opening experience. So I echo Nate's comment that it is a great way to learn more about RJ, to understand perhaps parts of the community that you may not be intimately familiar with, and to give back and make communities stronger.
So let's go back to our chat for more questions. Next one is from Joe. Bobby, very thoughtful presentation. How would you suggest utilizing restorative justice principles for prosecution of drug dealers, particularly those who are motivated primarily by their own addictions rather than money?
Yeah, so here my my pre-RJ brain is kicking in, because I think we need pretty comprehensive revision of our drug laws. And so that I'm having a little tug of war there, but we get nothing from incarcerating people. And that I fully recognize that impairing substances have devastated many communities, but incarcerating people who were involved in the drug trade is not changing behavior. And so I think there's, much as Nate just said, there's just as much room for working with people to help them gain an appreciation for the impact of their behavior, holding them accountable without imposing punishment, because I'm not sure what we're getting out of that. Incarceration isn't creating the outcomes that we are hoping for, so I don't understand why we keep doing it.
That is a great segue into our next question from Maria. Are you familiar with the Compassion Prison Project? Is this a similar idea, but by entering the prisons to offer emotional support for people already incarcerated? Maybe it will not be necessary in the future if RJ becomes available or universal.
So I'm not familiar with that. Happy if whoever raised that question wanted to share a thought about it.
Maria, if you're available, if you'd like
Yes, I'm here.
Wonderful, thank you.
It was a friend of mine is involved in it. It's a young woman who goes into the prison, and there's a meme or a viral video that she has on Facebook, in which she enters a prison, and in the yard, this enormous circle of men, and she is asking them to step forward if they have never been harmed, essentially. I mean, she asks different questions, but in talking about the harmed person, and there were none of them who could step forward. They all had been harmed in some way. And so when you said that, the harmed person, that really resonated. But it's a very small, I think, organization. I think she's becoming more effective. But there are two ways to operate, either we have this huge system already in place, and how do you deal with the people who are already incarcerated, helping them to understand how to reintegrate into society after they've been forced into this prison. So
thanks, Maria, and pick up on something that I think Nate posted, which is the Vermont Department of Corrections created the so-called, I'm not sure they created it, but they certainly have used it, and I think more so than any other state, the so-called COSA program, C-O-S-A,
yes.
Circles of Support and Accountability. And the idea is that transitioning from a correctional facility back into the community is hard, and without support, it is even more difficult. So COSA takes trained community volunteers who meet regularly with this individual who is released to not only develop a relationship, but also hold that person accountable and help them with the transition back into society. And it started initially for people who had been convicted of sexual offenses, and I think it's broadening now to a wider audience. It's foolish to think that an individual who's been incarcerated for any length of time can somehow seamlessly transition back into the community. We need transition. We need support for that process. I do want to put in a plug for a podcast that I just learned about, and it's called Making Amends, and it's available all the places you find podcasts, but it's a professor from Washington State who taught a course in an Oregon correctional facility. And it's some in-depth interviews with people serving extraordinarily long sentences and how their thinking about what they did changed over time. Worth a listen to.
So we have time for 2 more questions, and I'm going to summarize because we have a few people in the chat that have been asking for resources, agencies, organizations where people can learn more about restorative justice. So Bobby, anything that you would like to share? And I see that people in the chat are sharing with each other. Thank you so much for doing that. And then Shannon, we're going to have you wrap it up for our last question.
Well, so I have to put in a plug for my host institution again, Vermont Law School. If you go to the Center for Justice Reform, you will find quite a bit of information. There's another organization called the National Association of Community and Restorative Justice, and that is a great resource. Vermont Court Diversion Programs, Vermont Justice Centers, and the Department of Corrections in Vermont will actually provide resources as well. And I am happy to take emails from anybody, rsand, R-S-A-N-D, at vermontlaw.edu to steer folks in to share more resources. I will tell you, when we launched the RJ program at Vermont Law School, it's about 5 years ago that we started it. You could type in restorative justice, not a lot. Type it in now, and there is a lot of information, and I feel great about that.
So our last question will come from Shannon. Thank you so much.
Hey, thank you. I have a question. I'm really interested in what you have to say about this. You touched on it a little bit in the conversations around equity for different types of crimes and what individuals may view as, you know, justice in one situation may be very different than somebody else who's harmed in the same situation. And you spoke about how people who are harmed should have a voice in what that type of justice might be. And I'm curious how you imagine that working and what you know about it working when it comes to crimes like domestic violence or sexual violence or human trafficking or any kind of crime where the person who was harmed may not be in a safe place to come forward and share what has happened. It would actually place them in more danger. We see that a lot in those types of you know, gender-based violence crimes or just human trafficking. Yeah, so I know that there are some programs that are starting to work on that. We have a local program, Circles of Peace, that's working with low-risk domestic violence offenders with a restorative justice model. But I mean, there's just so much to think about. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Great question. And in Vermont and in other places, traditionally, to the extent RJ was allowed, it was not allowed for crimes of interpersonal violence. And I will tell you, I grew up, I started as a prosecutor in the no drop era. And that was considered the progressive approach, was that if there was an allegation of domestic violence, regardless of what the harmed party, the victim wanted, the prosecutor had to go forward. And increasingly now, people are seeing that as further disempowering of the party who was harmed. There's a professor from Baltimore who designed one of our courses at the law school. We have a course called New Approaches to Domestic and Sexual Violence. Professor Lee Goodmark has 2 books about how the traditional response to DV, domestic violence, and interpersonal violence is disempowering of victims, primarily of women. And so we have to give voice to the party most directly harmed. And when the state steps in and totally dictates what the outcome is, that is oftentimes further disempowering and in some instances compounding danger. And I agree, Shannon, it is much more complicated where a person, a harmed party, cannot even express a wish or desire, but there's a lot of distance between that end and what we do right now, which is the state stepping in to decide how to respond to harm. And that is unfair, disempowering, and oftentimes doesn't lead to justice. There are many instances in the domestic arena where conviction and incarceration is not the sought outcome, not the desired outcome from the party most harmed. Safety is paramount, and the state, I think, has to be more attuned to that.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming to our first event for our speaker series. For those whose questions we did not get to, we are sorry. And I'm going to turn things back over to Jeff Backus, our House Director of the Hartford Dismas House.
No, thank you, Bobby. That was outstanding. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I know it's 1 o'clock, so we're going to wrap it up. We hope to see you all again on February 26th when Attorney General TJ Donovan will be speaking on our behalf. Thank you.
And the link to register for that is in the chat box. So please feel free to go ahead and do that. And it will also be emailed out to you in a follow-up email next week. Have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you for coming.
That's all.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bobby. This was fantastic. Fantastic.
Good turnout, good crew.
Oh my gosh, that was just
Great.
fabulous.
Great. Really wonderful.
Thank you so much. It totally exceeded any hopes or dreams that we had.
Oh, that's great.
We were kind of terrified that no one was going to ask a question, and we all had these like little backup things. That was marvelous. And technology worked. Jen, you're brilliant.
No, you.
No, that was just terrific. Thank you.
And Jeff, nice job doing the introduction. So
Oh, Jeff, you were great.
I have a question. I don't know if you can. I don't know if you can hear me. This is Eleanor Coffey. Can you hear me?
yes.
Yes.
Yes, I would like to know whether this will be, if one can observe it either on a YouTube or in some, whether it's being recorded, because I do know some people who I would like to be able to recommend this to.